You see, silence is not surrender. It's not weakness, and it's certainly not avoidance. When you stayed silent, you activated one of the most powerful forces in human interaction: mystery. In that moment, you ceased to be predictable, and instead you became a riddle. And nothing shakes a person more than when someone they thought they understood stops responding the way they expect. You didn't scream, you didn't argue, you didn't run after closure. You simply held your peace. And that disrupted every story he told himself about you. Because people expect confrontation, they expect drama, they expect you to fall apart. But you didn't. He was counting on your reaction to maintain his sense of superiority, of control, of emotional dominance. Your silence robbed him of that. And now, instead of being the one leading the situation, he's the one left wondering, guessing, overanalyzing. Your silence became the conversation he can't stop having with himself. You're not speaking to him, but your silence is louder than any words you could have chosen. He didn't expect that. He didn't prepare for that. And that's when his mind began to spiral. Because in the absence of answers, the brain creates them. And often, those imagined answers hurt more than any truth. You weren't playing games. You were protecting your peace. But to him, it was a move he couldn't read. And people fear what they cannot understand. You walked away with grace, without bitterness, without slamming doors. And that's what confused him the most. He was ready to argue. He was ready to defend himself. He even had reasons lined up to justify his behavior. But you never gave him that stage. And when someone is deprived of the spotlight they expected, they start rehearsing for an audience that isn't even watching. And so it started happening in his mind. He began to replay every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out when you stopped caring. When did the power shift? When did the energy change? And while he was lost in that internal investigation, you were rising. Emotionally, spiritually, mentally, you were moving forward. He thought your silence meant you were stuck. But no, your silence meant you were healing. You weren't silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you no longer needed to explain yourself to someone who already chose not to listen. And that truth eats away at him in the quiet moments, in the middle of the night, in the pauses between his distractions. Because that's where your silence visits him the most. When he's alone with his thoughts. He tells himself, you'll come back. That it's just a phase. That you'll eventually break the silence. But days turn into weeks, and you're still quiet. And now the questions begin to mutate into regret. The arrogance softens. The ego trembles. Because silence, when done with strength, has a way of making someone face themselves. And what he sees in himself isn't as strong as what he saw in you. That's what starts to disturb him. He's not just missing you. He's realizing what he lost. What he failed to value, what he took for granted. You see, in staying silent, you didn't shrink. You expanded. You gave yourself permission to grow beyond the noise. You stepped out of a cycle of emotional reactivity and into a place of mental clarity. And in doing so, you shook his foundation because he thought he had more time. He thought you'd always be available for another round of explaining yourself. He thought your emotions made you predictable, but your silence proved that your strength runs deeper than you imagined. That you have self-control, that you have wisdom, that you don't speak to be heard, you speak when it matters. And when it no longer matters, you walk away with your head held high. His guilt started to build not because you accused him, but because you didn't. He expected punishment, and instead he received indifference. He prepared for a war, and instead he got peace. And that peace felt like punishment. Because people who do wrong often rely on your pain to justify their actions. But when you offer no visible pain, no breakdown, no outburst, it forces them to carry the full weight of what they've done. They become both the villain and the witness. They must now narrate their own behavior to themselves. And in that echo chamber, your silence sounds like a verdict. So now he questions your love. He wonders if you ever truly needed him. He rewrites the story in his mind, trying to place himself in a better light, trying to make sense of your strength, but it doesn't work. Because deep down, he knows you didn't leave to hurt him, you left to heal yourself. And healing in silence, that's the kind of transformation no one can control. It's the kind of shift that can't be manipulated. It's the kind of growth that shocks people when they realize you're no longer affected by the same things that once broke you. Men aren't wired to deal with silence from a woman they once had access to. It's not the absence of noise that disturbs them. It's the absence of control. You didn't have to scream, explain, or argue. The moment you chose silence, you became a mirror he couldn't look away from. Every time he tried to recall your words, there were none. Every time he reached for drama or closure, he found peace. That peace wasn't comforting to him. It was unsettling. Because now, for the first time, he had no idea what you were thinking, feeling, or planning. And for someone who thought he knew how to push your buttons, your stillness disarmed him. A man who once believed he had influence over your emotions becomes restless when he no longer knows how to access your world. And silence isn't just about not speaking, it's about not reacting. That's where the true power lies. When you used to respond to every text, every call, every manipulation, he felt in control. But when you went silent, you took away the feedback loop. Suddenly, he could no longer measure his importance in your life. The silence made him question everything. Why isn't she reacting? Why isn't she reaching out? Did she move on? Did she stop caring? The unknown started tormenting him more than any angry message ever could. He starts checking your online status, your stories, your posts, searching for a sign that he still matters. But you don't give him one, and it drives him mad. The silence starts to sound like rejection. And that's when the male ego starts to crumble. You see, most men can handle a woman's anger, but they can't handle her indifference. Your silence stripped away his comfort. It interrupted his sense of superiority. And now he's having entire conversations in his head trying to decode what's happening. What did he miss? When did you stop caring? Why aren't you reacting? This psychological warfare wasn't planned. It happened naturally the moment you realized your worth. When you stopped giving him power over your emotions, you reclaimed your dignity. He thought your silence was temporary, that it was a tactic to get his attention. But when the silence extended, when you didn't return to the cycle, that's when the panic started to rise. Because now, he wasn't just wondering if you were hurt, he was wondering if you were healing. And healing, to him, meant losing you for good. The male mind thrives on patterns. He expected the pattern to repeat: argument, apology, return, anger, explanation, forgiveness. But when the pattern broke, he didn't know what to do. Your silence created a blank space in his story, and the masculine mind doesn't deal well with unfinished chapters. He starts projecting, assuming, remembering. Every memory with you becomes more vivid, not because you reminded him, but because your absence forced him to relive them. And each memory carries a new weight because now he sees it from a distance he didn't expect to be on. He hears your silence in everything, in the music you used to play, in the places you used to go, in the quiet moments when distractions fade and reality creeps in. That silence becomes his companion. It follows him into the night. It visits him when he least expects it. Because silence has a voice. It speaks in the language of consequences. You didn't have to say he lost you. The silence confirmed it. You didn't have to say you were done. The silence proved it. And now he sits in that realization day after day, hoping for a break in the silence that never comes. You didn't choose silence to manipulate. You chose it to protect your peace. You finally understood that not every battle is worth fighting. Not every hurt is worth expressing. And not every man deserves an explanation. The silence was your boundary, your shield, your reset. While he was scrambling for control, you were finding clarity. While he was obsessing over why you stopped speaking, you were learning how to speak life into yourself. And the more silent you became, the more chaotic his mind grew. Because when you used to speak, he could tune you out. But silence gave him no choice but to listen. To himself, to his guilt, to his insecurities. Silence flipped the dynamic. You became the one with the upper hand, not because you fought back, but because you didn't. You refused to match his chaos. You chose elevation instead of engagement. And in doing so, you disturbed every illusion he had about himself. He thought you needed him to validate your worth. But now, the silence is showing him that you were the one who brought value to the connection all along. He didn't just lose your words, he lost the version of himself that only existed when he had access to your energy. He underestimated how loud your absence could be. He thought silence was emptiness. But what he's learning is that silence is full of truth. And the truth is he's now trapped in a mental prison built by his own actions. Every moment of silence becomes a reminder of the chances he wasted, the words he didn't say, the ways he took you for granted. He no longer controls the narrative. The story now writes itself. And it begins with your silence and ends with his realization. He didn't expect the silence to affect him the way it did. At first, it felt like a victory. He thought he won. He assumed you were being dramatic, emotional, or trying to punish him, but as time passed, something began to shift. That quietness that he initially mistook for weakness started to weigh on him. There was no fight, no begging, no repeated messages asking for explanations. You gave him exactly what he said he wanted. Space. But space without chaos isn't what he was prepared for. Because when you removed yourself emotionally, when you chose not to engage, you did more than distance yourself. You removed his control over your mind. He wasn't prepared for you to walk away with your dignity. He was ready to debate, to manipulate, to twist things in his favor. That's the game he knew how to play. But you didn't play. And when the rules changed, the power shifted. Now he was left staring at an emotional battlefield with no opponent. No opponent means no reason to fight. And no reason to fight means he's left with nothing but his own reflection. That's where the real battle began. Not with you, but within himself. His ego wanted to believe you'd return, that your silence was temporary. But every day that you remained quiet, something inside him started to crack. Control is a powerful drug. People become addicted to the feeling of being needed, wanted, pursued. He thought you'd come back because that's what always happened before, but this time was different. This time your silence wasn't a pause, it was a statement. It said everything without speaking a single word. It wasn't about punishing him, it was about reclaiming your emotional balance. But to him, it felt like exile. Suddenly, he was cut off from the very supply that fed his sense of superiority. No texts, no arguments, no updates. Nothing. He started replaying everything, every word. every moment, every facial expression. He became obsessed with trying to figure out when things change. Why didn't she react? Why didn't she ask why? Why didn't she fight back? His mind became a storm of unanswered questions because in your silence, you forced him to face the parts of himself he didn't want to confront. Without your reactions to distract him, he had to examine his own behavior. And what he found was not easy to swallow. The longer your silence lasted, the louder his conscience became. And when the conscience starts speaking, it doesn't let up. The silence exposed his insecurities. It revealed how much he relied on your emotional availability to validate his identity. Without your attention, he started to question himself. Not because he missed the attention, but because he missed the reflection of himself in your eyes. You made him feel important. Even in conflict, he felt relevant. But now he wasn't sure who he was to you anymore. And that uncertainty led to frustration. Frustration turned to confusion. And confusion became anxiety. He began to spiral, but he kept it hidden. Outwardly, he pretended not to care. He smiled. He posted. He tried to show the world he was unaffected. But at night, when everything was quiet, your silence filled the room like a presence he couldn't shake. You took the emotional weapon from his hands simply by refusing to react. And in doing so, you forced him to sit with the version of himself that only you had seen. The version he buried behind charm, confidence, and false control. But now, without you responding, all he had was that version. And that version wasn't proud of how things ended. That version began to feel guilt, not because he missed you, but because he realized he mishandled someone who genuinely cared. And that guilt, that sharp, stinging guilt, became his new companion. When you don't respond to someone who thrives on control, you disarm them. You remove their power source. He couldn't pull you into emotional loops anymore. He couldn't make you defend yourself. You were no longer playing the part he assigned you. You left the stage, took off the costume, and walked into your peace. That unnerved him more than any shouting match ever could, because now he was left standing in an empty theater, performing for no one. His confusion was not about your silence, it was about your strength. How could you remain composed? How could you walk away with such clarity? How could you give him no explanation and still sleep peacefully at night? These questions became a cycle in his head, playing over and over, eating away at his confidence, because deep down, he knew the answer. You didn't stay silent to win. You stayed silent because you were done. And that reality hit him harder than any goodbye ever would. The realization that he had no more chances, no more emotional leverage, no more way back into your mind. That's what began to crush him from the inside out. And it all started when you stopped reacting, when you chose not to argue, not to explain, not to justify, when you decided that your peace was more valuable than his understanding, when you understood that clarity doesn't always require communication, and in that moment the control shifted. You weren't just quiet, you were powerful. You were unavailable to the old version of him, and that version wasn't equipped to handle the upgraded version of you. So while he unraveled in confusion, trying to find his footing again, you were already 10 steps ahead, calm, collected, and in control of a life he no longer had access to. He thought he was in control. He believed he had mastered the dynamic between you and him. He had learned the rhythm of your reactions, the tone of your voice when you were upset, and the timing of your forgiveness. He assumed you'd always come back to reason with him, to explain yourself, to express your emotions, to chase after clarity. That assumption became his comfort zone. He played the game believing you would always be the one trying to fix things. But what he didn't see coming was your decision to stop playing altogether. He had trained his mind to expect your emotional presence. He fed off the cycle. He fed off the energy of knowing you'd respond, that you'd care enough to keep the emotional loop going. But when you went silent, not out of anger, not out of strategy, but out of sheer self-respect, it destabilized everything. He initiated the game of manipulation, expecting a reaction. He pushed your buttons, tested your patience, and took your kindness for granted. But when he pressed those same buttons and got no response, that's when the real fear crept in. Because now you weren't reacting, you weren't reaching out, you weren't even trying to correct his distorted view, you weren't defending your heart anymore, and that scared him more than your anger ever did. He wanted to test how far he could go. He wanted to see if you would still break down, still cry, still text, still call, still apologize, even when he was the one at fault. But when none of that happened, he felt something shift. And that shift didn't come from you, it came from within him. The mind starts racing when expectations are broken. He expected to win by triggering you, by pulling on your emotional strings. But your silence was a response he didn't calculate. He had his next move prepared, but it was rendered useless when you didn't show up to the conversation. He was ready for the back and forth. He was prepared for the emotional tug of war. He thought he would win, like he always had before. But he didn't understand that you had changed. This wasn't the same version of you that cried yourself to sleep over words that weren't meant for you. This wasn't the same version of you that tried to convince him of your worth. That version of you was gone. And in her place stood someone who had outgrown the game entirely. You mastered it by doing nothing. And in doing nothing, you took all the power. Because real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg for understanding. It doesn't plead for validation. Real strength walks away quietly with its head held high. You didn't play his game. You ended it. Not with a loud declaration, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with silence. You closed the chapter without a final paragraph, and that's what made it unforgettable. He didn't lose to someone who outplayed him. He lost to someone who refused to play. While he was strategizing, you were evolving. While he was trying to create confusion, you were gaining clarity. While he was feeding his ego, you were feeding your soul. And the moment he realized that his actions no longer had an emotional impact on you, the illusion of control vanished. It was never about who could shout louder or argue better. It was about who could rise above the noise. And you did exactly that. You chose elevation over engagement. You chose growth over drama. You chose silence not because you had nothing to say, but because what you wanted to say no longer mattered. It no longer needed to be spoken. You knew your truth, and that was enough. There's a deep kind of disturbance that happens when someone expects chaos and gets calm instead. He expected to cause damage. He expected to spark conflict. But instead, you offered him stillness. He was left in the echo of his own behavior, replaying his words, his actions, trying to justify them to himself. But the more he replayed them, the more wrong they sounded. Because there was no distraction, no yelling, no emotional outbursts from you to use as a deflection, just silence. A heavy, undeniable silence that pointed the mirror back at him. And in that mirror, he saw the truth. That he lost you not because you changed, but because you finally saw your worth. He thought he would get to you by ignoring you, by belittling your emotions, by being unpredictable. But when you became silent, you disrupted the entire pattern. You broke the routine of dysfunction. And now he was the one checking his phone. He was the one wondering. He was the one imagining conversations that would never happen. The same silence he used to punish you had now returned to punish him. Except this time you weren't waiting on the other side. You had moved on emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And that scared him. Because now he knew he didn't just lose the game, he lost the player who stopped needing the game to feel whole. He didn't understand what was happening at first. When you stopped responding, when your energy disappeared from his world, when your silence became the only sound between you, it didn't immediately register. He thought you were being cold, stubborn, or trying to make a point. But slowly, something more intense began to settle in. Something far more unsettling than anger. You had detached, not emotionally reactive, not waiting around, not playing along. And when you emotionally detach from someone who once believed they could control your feelings, it causes a mental disturbance they don't know how to handle because they were used to your presence. They were addicted to your emotional accessibility. But now you had become unreachable, not physically, but spiritually, mentally, emotionally. And nothing disrupts a person more than losing access to something they thought they owned. He used to know how to get to you. He knew what to say to spark a response, what tone to use to shift your mood, what actions to take to make you beg for clarity. It gave him power. Even in conflict, he still felt like he had control over your emotions. But your silence changed the rules. When you stopped playing the emotional games, he had no more levers to pull. The absence of your emotional reactions left him standing in a void. And in that void, he found himself face to face with his own behavior. There was no one to argue with, no one to distract him from the truth, just stillness. And in that stillness, his mind became his own worst enemy. He didn't expect your absence to feel this heavy. He thought he could move on quickly, maybe even talk to someone new, surround himself with distractions. But it didn't work because none of it filled the silence you left behind. None of it felt like the energy you used to bring. And that silence began to haunt him. Not because he missed the drama, but because he missed the emotional security he didn't even realize you provided. Your presence used to ground him. Your care used to reassure him. But he only realized that once it was gone. Your detachment became the loudest message he had ever received. And he had no defense for it. It's easy to dismiss someone when you think they're always going to be there. When you believe they'll always respond, always care, always fight to stay, but when that energy disappears, when the emotional door closes without warning, it sends shockwaves through the mind of someone who was never expecting it. You didn't yell, you didn't beg, you didn't try to convince him to value you. You just stopped, and that scared him more than anything you could have said. Because your silence was not empty, it was full of meaning, full of strength, full of boundaries. It said everything your words used to scream, but in a way that couldn't be debated or denied. He began to realize that he no longer had emotional power over you. And that realization shook him to the core. Because when someone loses control over the one they used to manipulate, they don't feel free. They feel lost. You didn't just stop responding. You stopped feeling responsible for his emotions. You stopped taking on the weight of trying to fix what he continuously broke. And when you detached, you freed yourself, but you trapped him inside a loop of overthinking, replaying, questioning. Was she really done? Why didn't she react? Did she stop loving me? These questions repeated in his mind over and over, building pressure with no outlet. And that pressure turned into panic. He couldn't understand how you could just let go, how you could seem so calm, so unaffected. But it wasn't that you didn't feel. It was that you finally chose to stop feeling for someone who didn't feel for you. That shift, that decision, created a mental disturbance that no apology could fix. He started to notice the things you used to do for him. The way you listened, the way you encouraged him, the way you stood by him when he was falling apart. All the small acts of love that once seemed invisible to him now stood out like glaring reminders of what he lost. And he began to understand that he didn't just lose your attention. He lost your belief in him. Your emotional detachment exposed everything. It revealed how much he took for granted. It revealed how much of his confidence was built on your support. It revealed that the stability he felt wasn't his own. It came from you. And now with you gone, the cracks were showing. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't distract himself forever. Because the silence didn't fade, it grew. It filled every space he tried to run to, and it forced him to feel things he never wanted to feel. Guilt, regret, emptiness, and the worst of all, powerlessness. He used to be the one in control, but now he was the one hoping, waiting, wondering. You weren't cold, you weren't bitter, you were just done. Done explaining, done justifying, done carrying emotions that weren't reciprocated. You stopped giving parts of yourself to someone who only noticed your value in your absence. And that absence became a presence in his mind, a presence that kept him up at night, a presence that reminded him every day that he pushed away someone who was never trying to hurt him, only love him. And now that love had turned into distance, and that distance had become a silence he couldn't escape. There's something sacred about the quiet after chaos. That moment when you decide not to respond, not to explain, not to justify, but to simply breathe, to be still, to let the storm outside of you rage on while you choose calm within. That's where your healing began. Not in shouting matches, not in endless text messages trying to make someone understand your worth, not in waiting for an apology that never came. No, it began in the silence, in the decision to sit with your own pain, to acknowledge your own wounds, and to finally say, I deserve better than this. You didn't broadcast your healing. You didn't turn it into a performance. You didn't need to, because real healing is quiet. It happens in the background, slowly, deeply, authentically. While he was still expecting a reaction, still waiting for a confrontation, still hoping for you to fall apart, you were building yourself up. Piece by piece, thought by thought, choice by choice. The same silence that made him uncomfortable gave you room to grow. It gave you time to think. It gave you space to see clearly what you were once too emotionally attached to recognize. And in that clarity, you realize something powerful. You don't need closure from the person who hurt you. You don't need validation from someone who was inconsistent. You don't need someone to understand your worth in order for it to exist. The silence became your sanctuary. A place where your thoughts weren't interrupted by manipulation. A space where your voice wasn't drowned out by accusations. A season where your energy was no longer being drained by someone who only came close when they needed something from you. You finally had time to listen to yourself, to the wisdom you had buried under all the noise, to the intuition you had silenced for the sake of keeping peace with someone who wasn't at peace with themselves. And as you listened, you started to remember who you were before the pain, before the confusion, before the emotional exhaustion. That version of you had been waiting patiently for you to return. Healing didn't look like pretending to be happy. It didn't look like rushing into distractions or forcing a smile to prove you were fine. It looked like sitting in your room and crying without shame. It looked like writing down your thoughts to understand your emotions. It looked like not reaching out even when the loneliness felt unbearable. It looked like choosing yourself again and again, even when your heart missed what was breaking you. That's the part most people don't see. That's the part he never imagined you were strong enough to do. He thought you would break without him, but instead you broke the cycle. He thought you would crumble in the silence, but instead you found peace. And while you were healing, something even more powerful was happening. You were transforming. The woman who once settled for mixed signals, for half love, for conditional affection, was slowly being replaced by a woman who now demanded consistency, respect, and emotional safety. The more you healed, the less interested you became in chasing, in proving, in fixing, because you realized your role was never to heal him. It was to heal yourself. And in healing yourself, you outgrew everything that once felt comfortable in dysfunction. You no longer romanticize the struggle. You no longer call pain passion. You began to see clearly, and what you saw changed everything. You stopped asking, why did he do this to me? And started asking, why did I allow this for so long? That shift was the turning point. That was when you stopped being the victim of your story and started becoming the author of it. You began to set boundaries, not out of anger, but out of love for yourself. You began to walk away, not to teach him a lesson, but to protect your spirit. You began to love yourself the way you always wanted someone else to love you. Fully, unapologetically, and without condition. The healing didn't come all at once. There were days when you felt strong and days when the memories pulled you back. But even in the setbacks, you were still moving forward, because every time you chose silence over reaction, you were choosing healing. Every time you didn't explain yourself to someone who never listened, you were honoring your growth. Every time you resisted the urge to reopen the door that once hurt you, you were proving to yourself that you had. And that change, that inner transformation, became your freedom. He doesn't know what's happening inside of you. All he sees is the silence. But what he doesn't realize is that the silence is where you found your voice. Not the voice that speaks to others, but the voice that speaks to yourself. The voice that says you are enough. The voice that whispers, keep going. The voice that refuses to settle for half love, confusion, or emotional games. That voice is louder now. It's steadier, it's wiser, and it's leading you into a new chapter. A chapter where your peace is not negotiable, your heart is guarded with wisdom, and your silence is no longer a response to pain, but a result of power.